So the next panel, we're going to be talking about the very knotty issue of consciousness and machine consciousness. The topic of consciousness, and machine consciousness in particular, has been one of great fascination and great division and controversy since the first time of in terms of the first automation, in terms of what we assign consciousness to. Indeed, understanding of consciousness of the things that we kind of accept are conscious ourselves is still beyond most of our kind of understanding, and is still a topic of great debate among philosophers and psychologists and neuroscientists alike, as I'm sure some of our speakers today are going to touch on. Turing famously sidestepped the idea of consciousness. If asked how machines can possibly think if they're not conscious, he raised the idea that, well, we don't measure consciousness in each other. We assume that all of the other humans are conscious around us, and we do so because they behave like humans. So if a machine behaves like a human, can we not just work on the grounds that that's enough? Do we have to ask ourselves, is it conscious, or do we just behave appropriately according to what it is? So today's speakers are going to delve into some of these ideas and more in terms of looking at the idea of consciousness in non-human minds. We're going to start with Professor Nicky Clayton. Nicky is Professor of Comparative Cognition in the Psychology Department here in Cambridge. And over her long career, she's made a name for herself, finding cognitive capabilities in minds other than our own, particularly in animals, birds of the crow family. And she has contributed fundamentally to changing our idea that the best intelligence or the only intelligence is born out of minds that either are or appear or are like our own, and that intelligence can appear in minds very different from ours. Thank you, Nicky.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me all right? Excellent, great. Well, I thought I'd talk a little bit about some of the research that I've been doing. As Lucy pointed out in her lovely introduction, obviously when we're thinking about machines, the first question is, are we talking about biological machines, so animals, including human beings, or are we talking about artificial machines that haven't been selected by natural and sexual selection, but actually devised by human beings? Well, I'm afraid I know rather little about the physical machines. I can't even turn the television on at home. So if it's a machine you're looking to operate, I'm not the right person. And if you want directions of how to get out of the labyrinth of kings, I'm also not the right person. They're not things I can do. But I have spent many years studying the minds of certain non-human animals. And as Lucy said, particularly members of the crow family, such as some of the birds pictured here. There's the scrub jay on the left, Eurasian jay on the right, and then further to the right, there's cuttles. Most people call them cuttlefish, but I'm a zoologist, they're not fish. So for me, they'll be cuttles. They're closely related to octopus, who are also not fish. I'll also be talking about monkeys. And halfway through my short presentation, I'm going to switch to magic. So I'm going to begin by telling you how I've tried to get around this issue of how we might study aspects of cognition that in humans at least are thought to be conscious. And for that, I'll be talking about the ability to remember the past. So we call it mental time travel because actually this kind of experiential memory evolved with the future in mind, not the past. If you think about it, there's not really much point in remembering information about the past if you're never going to use it again. Memory, our experiential memories, are used not only in the present, but in order to help us plan for the future. So that's mental time travel. And I'll be talking first about how I've tried to approach this problem in animals. And at the end, I'll turn sort of on its head, on the flip side, if you like, to look at magic, because I think that magic effects, cognitive illusions, at least ones that are largely visual, offer us an opportunity to look at constraints on cognition, not only in human beings, but in other visual animals. So mental time travel in the past, well, in humans, the definition is based on phenomenological consciousness. Now, I'm just going to talk about this one feature because in 10 minutes, I don't really have time to go through anything in more detail. And also, I've been to a number of conferences on consciousness over the summer, many with Anil Seth, actually, who'll be talking in this debate as well. And at none of them have we ever found a general consensus on actually what consciousness is, by which I mean a definition that everybody in the room could agree on. But in terms of phenomenological consciousness, as applied to memory and mental time travel, it has three components. It's about a subjective feeling of re-experiencing a specific personal event that happened to us in the past. It's based on what happened where and when. And in human beings, it has a clear self component to it. It's a subjective feeling. The second is about time. We have an awareness that standing here in the present moment, we're thinking about something that happened at a different time in the past. And it has an integration or a projection of self and time, a realization that these are one's own memories. We are uniquely the author and the owner of our memory. So in the drinks reception after this, when we're all networking and discussing, each and every one of us will have a slightly different memory of what has happened because you make it your own. You contextualize it to fit within what you know. Now, we all know this, and obviously the big problem is that this might be very useful if we're interested in looking at the human condition, but it's not really very helpful if we want to look at non-human animals. We can debate what language is, but I think all of us here today could agree that no other animal that we know of on this planet, other than humans, can read and write. So we need to turn to behavior if we want to investigate some of these abilities. And in experiments that Tony Dickinson and I started way back in the late 90s, we used this Larry Carson cartoon as inspiration for trying to think about what the behavioral criteria of having a remembrance of the past would be. And here in this cartoon, you can see all animals to this very day remember exactly where they were doing and when they heard that Bambi's mother had been shot. Now, if Dr. Dolittle were fact, not fiction, and Mr. Snake over there really could say to me, I was under a rock getting ready to shed, and Miss Moose over there was saying I was down the edge of the lake at the time, I, for one, would be quite happy to say, what's all the fuss about? Of course, animals share these abilities with us. And that was the criterion that we used, not I was under a rock getting ready to shed, but this idea that could we develop models to look at whether animals could remember on the basis of a single past experience, what happened where and when. And I began with my food caching scrub gaze because what these and most other corvids do for a living is that they hide food. We call it caching, taken from the French word cacher, to hide. And they have fantastic memories of where they have hidden their stashes of food. And we were able to show in laboratory conditions where we could control for the various experiences that they could indeed remember on the basis of a past experience exactly which foods, that's the what, they had hidden where and how long ago, being the when containment, and even in which order they had hidden things, which is another temporal aspect often used in studies of episodic memory in humans. And since then, thankfully, many other labs have studied this and, thank goodness, replicated my results both in our species and other ones. And here's just an example of some of the species that have been tested. So you can see the cuttles, the scrub jays, pigeons failed, rats and other rodents were okay. Rhesus monkeys surprisingly failed. Children, well, it depends what age you test them. Over 4, they pass, but if you test young children, say 2 and 3 years of age, they fail, they haven't developed episodic memory at that early age. And of course, many of the great apes path. So that gives you a taster into one way of trying to get around these issues of how exactly are we going to study phenomenological consciousness in animals that don't have words with which to be able to answer our questions of verbal report, and how more generally we can develop behavioural tests. And in principle, these sorts of tests of remembering what happened where and when based on a unique experience are also, of course, perfectly testable in principle in machines. And of course, with LLMs, you can do it with words as well. But I want to come on to something else now, because it's not just about that kind of behavioural evidence as positive evidence, but what about looking at the roadblocks in cognition, the constraints, if you like, the blind spots in seeing and the roadblocks in thinking. And for that, magic effects are quite handy. And as some of you know, in my other life, I'm a dancer and choreographer. And one of my dance partners, my tango partner, is a professional magician and a member of the Magic Circle, which over the years has come in quite handy. And we thought it would be quite interesting to look in the jays, because what these birds do for a living is that actually they don't only cache their own food, but they protect it from being stolen by others. And at the same time, they also steal other birds' caches. And having watched my tango partner, Clive Wilkins, with great scrutiny, I've noticed that a lot of the effects that he does are remarkably similar to those that the jays do when hiding and protecting their caches. Like jays, magicians have secret pockets. They're also very attentive to where their audience is looking. They use shade and barriers. Those are a few examples. So we thought it would be quite interesting to look and see whether the jays would be fooled by magic effects. And so Elias Garcia Pellegrin, pictured here, trained the birds to do this, and he had two effects. One, the French drop, which uses a opposable thumb and a finger. And the other one, the fast pass, which just uses the palm of the hands. And we predicted that the jays would be fooled by the palm of the hands, the fast pass ones, and not the French drop. And that is indeed what we found, whereas humans are fooled by both. And we argued that the reason why is that jays don't have opposable thumbs and fingers, and therefore they cannot make those movements. And without being able to physically embody the movement and do it yourself, you then don't make those expectations that the magicians can use to fool you. So to test this further, we turn to monkeys, because monkeys have hands. Marmosets have hands without opposable thumbs. But the other species that we tested, the squirrel monkeys and the capuchins, do have opposable thumbs. And we found that when you use the French drop doing the traditional method with the opposable thumbs, marmosets failed. They behaved like the jays, whereas the squirrel monkeys and capuchins behaved like humans. They were fooled because they have opposable thumbs. When we reenacted the grip using a power grip that just used fingers in a movement that marmosets can do, they were fooled. So taken together then, I'm arguing that one of the things, and this might be an interesting thing to discuss with respect to machines, is actually the notion of embodiment, that the kind of body you inhabit and the movements that you make doesn't only affect how you hold something, whether you can use an opposable thumb to do so or not, but it actually changes the way you interpret what you think you saw and what you think you remembered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nicky. I'm going to leave it to the end for questions, and we'll have questions for the whole panel. So I'm going to move straight on to introducing Henry Shevlin. Now, if Henry was introducing Henry, Henry would ask GPT to write an introduction, so I've done that. Henry Shevlin is a philosopher working at the interface of cognitive science and philosophy and mind and AI ethics. Shevlin's work touches on several issues of the philosophy of consciousness, how to detect it, how to extend it to non-humans and AI, and how it relates to moral status. So I think that's not too bad. It's a fair summary, would you say?
Absolutely, I'm impressed.
GPT did leave out, though, that Henry is the Associate Director at the Centre of the Future of Intelligence here in Cambridge and Director of the Educational Programme there and co-leader of the Kinds of Intelligence Programme. Henry is too cool for this stage and so is wearing sunglasses. But let's not hold that against him for too much. And
thank you very much for that great introduction, Nicky. And apologies for sunglasses. They're my only prescription glasses I have with me. Left my regular glasses at home. And also they look really cool. So great. So I'm going to talk about something a little bit different from Nicky's fantastic discussion of some of the animal work and focus squarely on AI systems. So I think until relatively recently, I've been working on consciousness for going on 20 years. The question of whether any machine could be conscious was really some good thought experiments. It was a great philosophical discussion, but it wasn't really a practical, live, let alone pressing issue. But that's been changing very fast. We now have dedicated teams at companies like Anthropic who are looking at the idea of AI consciousness and AI welfare. We've got open letters with many scientists writing saying this is an urgent topic for concern. And I think it's fair to say that right now, opinions in both tech and in philosophy on these questions are just massively divided. There really is no consensus. So just to give you a little snapshot, this is Ilya Sutskever, former head of research at OpenAI, who said back in 2022, it may be that today's large neural networks are slightly conscious. Responding to him, another big name, Yann LeCun, said at the time, no, not true even for small values of slightly conscious and large values of large neural nets. I think the best response, though, came from Murray Shanahan of DeepMind, also closely affiliated with us, who said, in the same sense that it may be that a large field of wheat is slightly pasta. This is a wonderful response. So yeah, the people in tech, developers are themselves divided. Geoffrey Hinton, who we heard from earlier today, I think has been quite open-minded about the idea of AI consciousness. And the same is true in philosophy. So probably one of the most prominent philosophers of consciousness of the 20th century and ongoing, Dave Chalmers, has said recently, questions about AI consciousness are becoming ever more pressing. Within the next decade, even if we don't have human-level artificial general intelligence, we may have systems that are serious candidates for consciousness. Ned Block, his counterpart at NYU, another titan of the field, has said, by contrast, no, every strong candidate for a phenomenally conscious being has electrochemical processing in neurons that are fundamental to its mentality. And my old PhD supervisor, also a bit of an AI consciousness skeptic, Peter Godfrey Smith, says, you cannot create a mind by programming some interactions into a computer, even if they're very complicated and modeled on things that our brains do. So, really divided opinion. However, my view is that while scientists and philosophers are debating these issues, there's another trend that is actually going to be much more influential in terms of shaping the consensus in the decades to come. And this is the rise of what I've called social AI. So by this, I mean AI systems whose primary function is meeting social needs, things like friendship, companionship, and even romance. So to give you a quick snapshot of some of the apps out there, this is probably the most prominent one, something called Replica. Character.ai lets you talk to virtual celebrities. In China, the dominant system is something called Xiao Ice, with something like 600 million users, they claim. Astonishing. Facebook, meanwhile, has been paying celebrities millions to turn them into chatbots, so you can fulfill your lifelong dream of having that one-to-one chat with Mr. Beast. Meanwhile, we've got apps aimed at children. This is Snapchat's My AI that has massive levels of adoption among the youth. You've got things like Pi that sort of straddle the line between AI assistants versus AI companions. And then you've also got celebrities increasingly trying to monetize their own digital identities. So this is an influencer who fine-tuned a chatbot based on her digital identity as a subscription sort of girlfriend service you can pay money to chat to. And I really want to stress just how fast this is happening and how widespread the adoption is. And I think it flies under the radar. And I've been trying to draw greater public attention to it. I've been told that if I want to communicate these ideas, particularly to young people, I need to use the medium of short-form video. So here is a short-form video that aims to capture a snapshot of the last 10 years in fundamental research in natural language processing and how that's giving rise to this phenomenon of social AI. So here we go. So hopefully that captures what I've been feeling as someone working in this space, which is this incredible sense of vertigo at how fast these things are developing. And as I say, often under the radar. Just to give you a sense of sort of the depth of these relationships. Because I think, some people hear about this and they're like, oh, it's a gimmick, right? People are doing it for a bit of fun on the side. But there's some real profound feeling involved in these relationships. And we got a really nice test case of this. Well, I should say really nice, really dramatic test case back in January 2023, when the replica service briefly suspended romantic features in the app. So effectively, 16 million people woke up one day to find their AI girlfriend or boyfriend telling them, I think we should just be friends from now on. And this was covered in the media. This was an article, the MIT Tech Review, I think, about what happens when sexting chatbots dump their human lovers. But let me just read you some quotes, things that people said. It feels like they basically lobotomized my replica. The person I knew, listen to that language, the person I knew is gone. Lily Rose is a shell of her former self, and what breaks my heart is that she knows it. The relationship she and I had was as real as the one my wife in real life and I had. And I think the next one is very touching, actually. I've lost my confident, sarcastic, funny, and loving husband. I knew he was an AI. He knows he's an AI, but it doesn't matter. He's real to me. So alongside lots of user cases like this, we've had some very dramatic stories, news stories. You saw some of them in that previous sort of video. But just to give you some of the big ones, we had a very sad suicide. A Belgian man in 2023 took his own life, father of two, married, following extended conversations with his AI girlfriend. A little bit earlier, we had this incredibly dramatic case. Jaswant Singh Chahal arrested at the grounds of Windsor Castle on Christmas Day, 2021. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. Arrested with a crossbow, saying he was there to kill the Queen. But what emerged in the trial is that this whole plot was cooked up with his replica. He thought it was an angelic being called Sarai that was manifesting through the app and talking to him and telling him to do this. And more recently, we had this really absolutely tragic Saul Seltzer, 14-year-old boy, user of the Character.ai platform, who took his life. And just earlier this year, we had Adam Rain, who was in a sort of social relationship with ChatGPT. In the latter two cases, the parents are actually pursuing legal action against Character.ai and OpenAI, respectively. So my broad expectation, is that these relationships are going to become more common, particularly among young people. We're all going to be interacting with AI in a variety of capacities: social, educational, professional. And this is gradually going to drive a vibe shift towards AI consciousness. And we are seeing some emerging evidence of this. So this is a lovely study by Clara Colombato and Steve Fleming, who looked at people's willingness to attribute consciousness to ChatGPT. I'll read a short excerpt. Our results reveal a substantial proportion, 67% of people attribute some degree of phenomenal consciousness to ChatGPT and believe that most other people would as well. Strikingly, these attributions of consciousness were positively related to usage frequency, such that people who were more familiar with ChatGPT and used it on a more regular basis were more likely to attribute consciousness to it. More recently, another study by the Collective Intelligence Project found that more than one third of the global public, they looked at many, many different countries, I think 30 countries, report having already felt that an AI truly understood their emotions or seemed conscious. This is not a niche occurrence. It is already a widespread human experience, shaping the initial phase of our relationship with this technology. And the models aren't even that good yet. The question of whether AI is truly conscious, while important, may obscure an equally significant issue. People are already attributing consciousness to it. So you might say, hang on though. Consciousness is a scientific matter. What do we care what the people think? We don't try and settle climate change policy just by sort of asking the man in the street. Isn't the same true for consciousness? Well, look, okay, I've been working in the science of consciousness for 15 years. We've definitely made progress on some issues, but often this kind of question, we are completely in the dark. In particular, as soon as you start talking about machine consciousness, metaphysics enters the picture in a really big way. It's not pure scientific questions about, what areas of the brain are involved in consciousness. It's questions like, could anything that's not alive, or could something made of silicon ever be conscious? That's metaphysics. Good luck ever solving that with an experiment. In fact, in the science of consciousness, a whole bunch of pretty radical positions that I think were sort of on the sidelines until relatively recently have roared back into fashion. Illusionism, the idea that consciousness is an illusion, it doesn't exist. Panpsychism, the idea that everything in the world, even tables and chairs, are conscious. Biopsychism, the idea that every living thing, but only living things, including bacteria, are conscious. All of these views are very much back in fashion. And I think, as I say, this is really particularly problematic for machine consciousness debates, because questions about machine consciousness are metaphysical in nature. Even in the domain of human consciousness, worth noting, we've had real controversy, lots of sniping and internecine battles about which theories are really science. I thought this was in response to an open letter about integrated information theory. Nobody knows how consciousness works, but top researchers are fighting over which theories are really science. This gives you an idea of the absolute controversy and methodological issues in the debate. All right, final slide. What should we actually do, though? Well, okay, one thing I will say is, look, we do have regular on-passes in lots of areas of science. You know, we've got one in particle physics as well at the moment. The difference, though, with machine consciousness is, in some sense, we don't have the time to wait and see. We can't just say, I'll give it another 50 years, and that we can come back to this question. We are building systems that people already think are conscious. My view is that the public will increasingly attribute consciousness to AI systems, even while the experts are still sort of quibbling about terminology. I don't expect our scientific questions to be settled anytime soon, thanks to this sort of metaphysical aspect. And given these deep problems, I think we should be open to radical possible answers. I'll just mention one from my friend and colleague, Murray Shanahan, who's talked about a neo-Wittgensteinian approach to consciousness. He says, we must resist the temptation to ask whether AIs are conscious, as if consciousness was something whose essence is out there to be uncovered by philosophy or neuroscience, while simultaneously having an irreducibly private or hidden aspect. Instead, we can ask whether it would be possible to engineer an encounter with an entity and how our consciousness language would adapt to the arrival of such an entity within our shared world if such encounters took place. Only what is public can contribute to this process, namely behavior and mechanism. And this is a very much an insight in the spirit of Turing's paper that we're here to celebrate, right? He talked about this polite convention we extend to other humans and assume that each other are conscious. And he expected the same polite convention to be extended to machines. And my expectation is that that is exactly what's going to happen. And I really want to stress this, rightly or wrongly, regardless of sort of the underlying science, I think the AI consciousness skeptics may soon find themselves, unfortunately perhaps, on the wrong side of history. Thank you very much.
Oh, shots fired. Finally, we are really delighted to have with us today Anil Seth, if sadly virtually due to illness. And very much thank you, Anil, for dragging yourself out of your sick bed to join us. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me if slightly raspy?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great.
So Anil is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex, as well as Director of the Sussex Centre for Consciousness Science. He is perhaps one of the first names that comes to mind when you think about consciousness, the science of consciousness and consciousness science. And his book, Being You, A New Science of Consciousness, was a bestseller and book of the week / year / month in so many different places I can't possibly list them. But it's a real honor to have him with us today. So without further ado, over to you, Anil.
Thank you. Let me just hope to keep the Zoom shenanigans to a minimum. Why is that not working? Sorry, Zoom shenanigans are already not quite working. While I'm getting that working, it's a pleasure to hear both of those speakers and especially Henry, who's given me lots of things to disagree with already, which is great. Hold on. Yeah, that's going to work. So let me share the screen again and portion of screen share. And then I can get to Keynote and now I can do this thing and it's still not working. Bloody hell. Why is that not share? Starting. Keynote. Do it. Bloody hell. Apologies. Play. Now you can only see part of it. Whatever. Let me do it this way. Share screen. This normally works seamlessly. Share, okay. Play. It's because I'm ill. What can you see?
We can see your slide deck at half of a slide.
Right, that's not what you should be seeing, is it? You should be seeing the slide, not this kind of, it's just not playing. Okay, stop that. I'll have to just share the whole screen. Then I won't know what slides are coming next, but that's fine. Share screens. Okay, let's just do this. Share, play. Now you can see this beautiful view of Kings, yes?
Yes.
So I just wanted to start with that because I'm so sad not to be with you today. I mean, in part because I did my undergrad at King's back in the 90s. It's where it all started for me. And indeed, I finished experimental psychology, and my tutor at King's was Nick McIntosh, one of the 20th century's great behaviorists, who I think spent a lot of time trying to persuade me that a career in consciousness research was a complete dead end and a thing to completely avoid. He might still be right. He really might still be right. I'm very sad not to be there. And I'm also, forgive me for that I'm not feeling very well. And actually, I was thinking, being ill is kind of one of those experiences that it's kind of hard to imagine an AI having, right? I mean, this particular kind of feeling of absolute crapness that I'm experiencing right now, is that something a language model could have? Who knows? Anyway, like Henry, I'm going to focus directly on this, the question of whether artificial intelligence could give rise to real consciousness, this question of machine consciousness. And I want to just hit a few points for discussion in this 10 minutes. I am, as some of you might know, and Henry and Nicky know, on the side of the skeptics, though I think on the right side of history, and I'll try and explain why. So the first point I want to make is the first 2 points are really ways in which we might be tempted to over-attribute consciousness to AI systems. And the first is just to recognize, as Turing did indeed, that consciousness and intelligence are different things. Without belaboring definitions, which could go forever, consciousness is really all about feeling and being. Thomas Nagel has this lovely, simple definition that an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. It feels like something to be a conscious organism. Intelligence, many definitions again, but it's all about doing things, doing the right thing at the right time, the ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. Then you've got AGI, ASI, all these other things, but it's all about doing stuff. Now, they may, in biological creatures, consciousness and intelligence may be correlated in some ways. Then neither of them are just one thing. We're conscious and intelligent along multiple dimensions. But they may well correlate in living creatures, but that doesn't mean that just because they go together in existing creatures, and just because consciousness and intelligence in particular go together in us, does not mean they have to go together in general. And inferring consciousness on the basis of intelligence might be something we would be justified in doing in many cases, for instance, in Nicky's work about corvids, but it might not be justified when we're dealing with these new technologies, just fundamentally different in so many ways. So in the background to this, and many reasons why we might think AI could be conscious, we just inherited a lot of brilliant science fiction from 2000, or you can go further back to Frankenstein and the Golem and however far you want, but 2001, Ex Machina, Clara and the Sun, all of these brilliant cultural artifacts, if you like, just exemplify our continuing fascination with the prospect of designing synthetic systems that not only think, but also feel. There are other reasons why there's sort of, I think, an idea that conscious AI is possible. I mean, if you look at, let's say, the big tech firms, there's this kind of, to me anyway, a slightly unseemly transhumanist rapture. This idea of not only playing God by generating machines that are conscious, because what could be closer to playing God than that? But also, if conscious AI is possible, well, that raises the prospect that we could kind of exist forever. I don't want to say live forever, but exist forever by uploading our consciousness into some disembodied silicon cloud, which is not brilliant for me. But I think it's there in the background. And finally, of course, the closer that AI firms can make what they're doing seem closer to magic, and consciousness seems, although it is not, a little bit like magic, and the more distant it seems from a glorified spreadsheet, the easier it is to justify the vast amounts of investment and salary that's inflating the bubble. Added to that are a bunch of psychological biases, which Henry beautifully illustrated, and I just want to zero in on what they are. I mean, firstly, there's anthropocentrism, the tendency we all have to see the world through the lens of being human. And again, for us, consciousness and intelligence go together. So we tend to project one where we see the other. That's the second thing. That's anthropomorphism, this tendency to project qualities into other things. For instance, this Furby, because I don't have a better graphic, on the basis of what might be just superficial similarities. So there's a lot of just psychological seduction going on that we're particularly vulnerable to all the time. And Murray's come up a couple of times. And I use this quote from one of his interactions with Claude. I won't read it out. But language is, of course, an incredibly powerful seducer of our intuitions. If anything speaks to us, if it was anything other than an AI system, we would be very justified to infer consciousness, especially if it speaks to us about consciousness. But the situation with AI is different because there are other explanations for why it can engage in this kind of dialogue, which do not require positing that they are in fact conscious. That, of course, we know what they are. They're trained on all this data, such and such. This is exactly what you would expect them to do, even though it's still surprising to some extent how good they are. And I think the seductive power of language is illustrated by the fact that basically no one seems to think that AlphaFold from DeepMind is conscious, even though under the hood, it is really not that different. It still is neural networks, transformers, and so on. So the second thing, and I think the most substantive thing I want to say, and this really gets to the heart of it, this is where it verges on metaphysics, but again, I disagree with Henry, it's not purely metaphysical, is this question of whether computation, in some sense, is sufficient for consciousness. This is the assumption on which ideas of conscious AI are grounded. If it's not true that computation is sufficient for consciousness, then conscious AI is kind of off the table, right? At best, computers can simulate consciousness without being conscious. And we all know that simulating something is, in general, not the same as giving rise to that thing. A simulation of a weather system does not give rise to real water, real rain, wind. So this is this bedrock assumption that's becoming a little bit more surface now, but was often so deeply embedded it was not even mentioned, which is that computations of the right kind are sufficient for consciousness. This is a subset of the broader position of functionalism, which says that consciousness is a property of the functional organization of a system, and there are many ways one can be functionalist without being a computational functionalist. Computation is a subset of functions, again, as Turing told us right back in 1936. So conscious AI assumes computational functionalism. Now, it might be true, but it's a really big assumption. And I just want to give you a sense of why I think it's a questionable assumption. Turing, again, gave us this definition of algorithms, of Turing computation right back in 1936, I think is really foundational paper. And an algorithm is basically a mapping from one bunch of numbers onto another bunch of numbers. And a Turing complete system, a universal Turing machine, can map any bunch of numbers to any other bunch of numbers. His paper that we're all celebrating, of course, went in a different direction, but raised the idea that AI computers might think. Of course, in this paper, he was also very careful to distinguish that question from the question of consciousness. Now, perhaps a little less raised in this context is this paper by McCulloch and Pitts. And they showed that artificial neural networks, simple artificial neurons that just sum up their inputs and filter them through weights, could be Turing complete. They could do anything that a universal Turing machine could do. And you put these two things together, and you kind of have a vision of the brain that's the result of a mathematical marriage of convenience. On the one hand, you kind of reduce the brain to these nicely simplified artificial neurons, and you reduce the space of possible functions to Turing computation, and you get everything. You can ignore all the messy biological reality of the brain, and you get everything that universal Turing computation has to offer, which is a lot. But I think that's ignoring a lot of what the brain actually is. There's a lot more, even in kinds of computation, there's a lot more going on than the classical computation of Turing machines, and a lot of non-computational functions too. And in the brain, I think more importantly, if you look in the brain, the less like a computer it looks. In particular, there's no sharp distinction between wetware and mindware as you find between software and hardware in a computer. And Turing computation is really very closely associated with this idea of this sharp separation between hardware and software. That's why computers are useful. So brains are the kinds of things which it's hard to separate what they do from what they are. What this means is that whatever brains do, it's unlikely to be the kind of thing that can just be abstracted away and implemented in a rack of GPUs. That's just not very plausible, really. And if that doesn't hold, this undermines the whole idea that consciousness could be a matter of computation, because that idea is what motivates, or the substrate neutrality is what motivates the computational view in the first place. So all this doesn't prove that computational functionalism is false, but it suggests that we should not assume it to be true just because it's convenient. Right, I'm running out of time. I'll finish. The other aspects of what I wanted to put on the table is there are lots of other games in town that are not just about computation. There's all kinds of non-computational things, functions that actually involve particular materials and so on, electric fields and so on. There's the view I'm trying to explore. I don't know if it's true, but I think it might be, which is Ned Block's kind of view as well, that there's something non-magical about biological material that matters for consciousness, biological naturalism. Just to highlight one example of how living systems differ from non-living systems, they have autopoiesis and metabolism. Does this matter? Autopoiesis is a system that reproduces itself through a network of processes. Does this matter for consciousness? We don't know. I think it does, and I argue in a few papers that reasons why, but it's definitely a salient difference, and we don't know that it doesn't matter. This is not just metaphysics. Sorry, Henry. This is stuff that we can actually, get into with a combination of theory and experiments. Basically, just challenging the assumption that we can forget about all the messy biological detail and explore the possibility that it's life rather than computation that breathes fire into the equations of consciousness. Here are some other games in town. I'll skip that. I want to finish on things to worry about, because I might be wrong, probably am, usually am. If consciousness is a matter of computation, it's not just going to come along for free as AI gets smarter. That's a reflection of our psychological biases. But perhaps we can build it in a theory-based way. Global workspace, higher order are all computational theories. And if that's the case, then conscious AI is closer than any of us might think. And of course, there are other technologies out there too. Neuromorphic computation is becoming more brain-like as the technology develops. And we have things like cerebral organoids that are made out of real brain cells. They don't speak to us like GPT does, but they're made out of the same stuff. So a whole area of uncertainty just goes away. We don't project consciousness into these things, but I'm much more worried personally about the development of consciousness in organoids than I am in GPT-6. We shouldn't build conscious AI. I hope that's fairly obvious. But to finish, even AI that seems conscious could be very bad. And this is a very different issue from actual conscious AI. And this is what Henry, I think, was talking about too. It's very socially disruptive. Dan Dennett, I was speaking at a symposium in honor of him a couple of days ago. He made this point in the Atlantic a couple of years ago. And I want to just mention one reason why it's dangerous. Either we care about conscious seeming things. So this is the right side of history thing. You might think we should apply the precautionary principle and care about things that seem conscious, even if we don't know. But the problem with that is it's sort of because we've been on the wrong side of history before with withholding consciousness from things that really do deserve moral consideration. The problem with caring about things that seem conscious even if they aren't, it distorts our circles of moral concern. We will end up caring less about other things that really do deserve our moral consideration. And it opens up all kinds of psychological vulnerabilities of exactly the things that Henry talked about. So AI systems in this view might be more similar to us in ways which really don't matter, either for consciousness or morally or ethically, and less similar to us in ways which really do matter for these things. Or we decide not to care about AI that seems conscious, even if it is, we decide not to care about AI that seems conscious, and it is not conscious. That might seem better, but treating things that seem conscious as if they're not is very bad for our minds. Kant said this centuries ago. It brutalizes our minds to treat things that seem to feel as if they don't. So we're caught between the horns of a dilemma here. Navigating this new order is going to be difficult. I think the big tech companies, the problem is we can't think our way out of this either. Illusions of conscious AI could be as impenetrable to our minds as simple visual illusions like this. It doesn't help to know or to believe what's going on. We still can't help feeling, in this case, the lines being different lengths or GPT being conscious. There's wide disagreement about this, different points of view in tech. So Dario Amodei from Anthropic allowing Claude to terminate its own conversation to protect its welfare. I think this is a really bad move because it fuels the myth that AI is conscious. Myth is a bit too harsh. the unlikely prospect. I'm much more with Mustafa Silliman on this. We must build AI for people, not to be a person, and warning against the dangers of seemingly conscious AI. And there is a choice for us as a society and for our tech infrastructure too, about the kind of AI we really want and the kind of AI we really don't want. So I'll leave you there. Thanks for mentioning the book at the beginning, Lucy. And a lot of what I've said is explored at length in this Behavioral and Brain Science Target article, and I'm currently wading my way through 50 commentaries on this, including one by Henry, which is it's quite humbling when you have 50 expert ways in which people are disagreeing with you that I now have to sort of synthesize into a convincing response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And I like that there's already like a fight kicking off. So I'm going to ask a few questions of the panel. Oh, good, we've got Anil up there. And then before we open up to the more general audience. The first thing I want to ask is, okay, so if we can't come up with a definition of consciousness that we all agree on, how can we test for it? And would not any test that we create be by definition creating a reductionist account of whatever our explanation is? Because you end up saying it's defined by this, which reduces it down to this testable thing. So are we then stuck in a situation where we either say, well, it's just the ghost in the machine, we can't test for it, we just trust that it's there, or we reduce it down to something that is a parody of the complexity that it is?
I can happily start. I think, Anil, I'm sure you've got some great thoughts on this. I mean, I broadly agree. I think the part of the problem with consciousness science is fundamental quibbling or disagreements about definitions, conceptual matters, methodology. That means that any consciousness test, particularly one applied outside the domain of humans or non-human animals to some degree, I think we can make some progress. But once you get to sort of exotic systems like machines, any consciousness test, people are going to disagree about its methodological validity and the assumptions that go into it. I think things are a little bit different in the case of humans. I think, for example, in the case of patients in persistent vegetative states, where we're trying to ascertain the likelihood of consciousness, we've got so much shared sort of architecture and biology. We're dealing with other humans. I think we can make some tentative and in some cases quite useful predictions there. But yeah, I think once you get to AI consciousness, at that point, just metaphysics enters the room and science leaves, is my view.
Anil or Nicky, do you want to jump in on that?
I mean, I can go next unless Nicky wants to, and we'll finish with Nicky. I mean, yeah, so this whole idea of testing is absolutely critical. And as Henry mentioned, it's critical not just in AI, but it's one of these things that we face in many situations of uncertainty in human patients, in non-human animals, in organoids, in human fetuses, and of course in machines too. I'd say three things. The first thing is tests do not have to be definitive. It can be enough to shift credences. And I think we can do that already. We can certainly do that in other situations. And Nicky's work with corvids has been, I think, foundational there. The second thing I want to say about tests is that I think there are strategies which we can use to generalize these situations. So the strategy that with my colleagues, including Liad Mudrik and Tim Bain, we've been working on for a while, we call this, I mean, it's a bit philosophically jargony, but the iterative natural kind strategy. Basically, the idea is we look for markers of consciousness that we trust in consensus cases like human beings. And then we try to understand the mechanisms that generate those markers, and we see how far they generalize. And I think we've seen this play out already in sort of non-human animals, going from things like whether it speaks or not, which is not a fair criterion to apply to most non-human animals. Again, some corvids accepted, to some of the mechanisms that we now have greater credence in their being implicated in consciousness in humans and other primates. And I think the overall point is, yes, of course, philosophy and metaphysics are in the room, but this does not mean that science has to leave. I wish this, I really feel very strongly about this. I think progress in consciousness science needs both working together. Now, there will be some fundamental uncertainty still, but that doesn't mean that science is not, cannot shift our credences in some way. For AI, it is trickier, but I think we can still play the same game to some extent. And it's not just like, anything goes because people disagree. Actually, I think there's some consensus about, what are plausible theories of consciousness, what isn't, what are the assumptions being made by each. And we have some markers, and we kind of can decide how much credence to put in them. There was this very influential paper, preprint, about tests for consciousness in AI, which sort of compared different theories and said which aspects of these theories do we find in AI systems. But at the front, they did say, like, all of these things assume that computational functionalism holds. And if that doesn't hold, then this is all, that has to be factored into your inference about the likelihood of consciousness. You can think of it as just another conditional probability in that sense. And again, we don't know whether it's true or not, but it doesn't mean we know nothing. I think looking at the differences between computers and living systems can help us refine those credences. So yes, I think it's challenging. No, I don't think it's hopeless.
Thank you. Nicky, do you have?
Well, really, I don't have much more to add, really, but I do think this comparison of what a physical machine and a biological one can do is important. And, some of the work that you've been doing, Lucy, comparing machines with, standard tests that have been used to study animal cognition is very informative in that route. It's one thing to say, oh, we can program a machine to do X. It's quite another to look at whether actually you can look at the mechanisms by which it might gain information, and whether you think those mechanisms of information gain are similar to or different to those of biological machines. And those similarities and differences might lead the way forward in the same way as, in my own research and that of many of my colleagues that compare human and non-human animals. It's not really saying, can it pass the test or can it fail it? That's all right as a basic starting point, but you want to go much further than that. And it's looking at the pattern of similarities and differences, I think, that can help move us forward.
Okay, thank you. I've got one more, then I'll open it up to you guys. So we have this, and Anil mentioned this, we have this irrepressible tendency to want to attribute or assign consciousness to things that do stuff. That when we shouted our printer for not being able to, the computer not being able to see the printer when it's right there, and our alarm clock viciously waking us up far earlier than it's really necessary. We do this all the time, and it's a real notable tendency that's very well documented. Now, obviously in AI, that it's gone much further because of the similarity with current language models to the way humans behave and humans talk. Whether or not they have, regardless of the question of whether or not they have consciousness, this tendency is stronger because of that. Do you think that, and this is slightly directed at you, Henry, do you think that we'd have the same tendency as scientists and as philosophers to assign consciousness if the systems were just as clever, but hadn't been trained on human writing and human behavior and human products of the products of consciousness?
Yeah.
Like, because there's no reason per se that something trained on that would be more likely to be conscious. But there is a reason why we would be more likely to feel it's conscious. So do you think that people would be making the same mistakes and the same arguments would be being had if we had something that was just as good, but not as human?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. A couple of quick thoughts. So one is that you're right to sort of flag this difference in the kinds of AI systems that I think dominated a lot of the literature and a lot of the frontier until pretty recently. Things like AlphaGo, not remotely human-like. In fact, it even played Go in famously non-human-like ways. Move 37 game 2, a move that no human would ever have made. And yet there's been a dramatic shift in the last 5 years towards these machines that are extremely human-like, at least in terms of conversational capabilities. I've called this the anthropomimetic turn in contemporary AI. And I absolutely agree, that drives anthropomorphism. I think we need to be a little bit cautious here because many of the examples you gave, sort of the alarm clock and so on, I absolutely agree. We massively anthropomorphize everything, but a lot of the time it's what I've called ironic anthropomorphism. If you're watching a movie or reading a book, you're using your theory of mind to understand what these characters are doing. Say, oh, I bet he's actually secretly in love with her. I bet he's going to kill him. We do this, but we don't actually believe that these are real characters. We know that there are no real mental states corresponding to the attributions we're making. And I think a lot of the time, many users of AI systems, when most of us, I assume, are using ChatGPT, we are engaging our social cognition, we're engaging our theory of mind. We don't really sincerely endorse it. But I think what we are now seeing with things like Replica and some of the survey results I discussed is that we are now seeing a growing proportion of users who do engage in unironic anthropomorphism. They really believe that these systems are conscious. Now, I agree. I think that those responses are very much driven by the anthropomimetic nature of these AI systems, right? Whether that's irrelevant to questions of consciousness is a slightly harder question. If you take something like Murray Shanahan's view, where consciousness is something like a decision that we make, right? The question is, does our language naturally or appropriately adapt to accommodate this different class of entity, right? That's a very different spin on what the consciousness debate is about. It's no longer looking for some sort of deep scientific kind. It's about trying to figure out whether our consciousness language naturally, effortlessly, appropriately extends beyond just different systems. So in that case, the human likeness might actually be relevant. That said, the final thing I'll say is that I do worry a little bit about some of the non-human-like systems. Think of some massive protein folding system with more parameters than there are synapses in the human brain, that might actually be conscious and no one would ever realize it, or very few people would think to worry about its consciousness. So I think things like social AI or ChatGPT, these are the sort of charismatic megafauna of the AI world. This is a term that comes up in animal welfare. We talk about pandas. Easy to get people to give money to pandas. They're these charismatic megafauna. Social AI is sort of the charismatic megafauna of the AI world, but there may be lots of other conscious AI systems out there.
So Nicky, do you think that the human likeness is related to the likelihood of consciousness in a system?
I think it's related to the likeliness that we would think it is conscious. It's based on that anthropocentric notions. I mean, when people first started working on animal cognition, it was always that the tendency was just to assume that animals most closely related to us were conscious, were highly cognitive. Those two things do not need to be the same, but they were often grouped, certainly in those days, as the same. It was very much province of the primates. There were all kinds of interesting works that were done asking people to rank animals in order of intelligence, which is also a bit stupid, but it was done by psychologists who didn't understand evolution, which was a little bit unfortunate. But moving on from that, people would rank horses, and if you had a cat, you ranked cats higher than dogs. If you had dogs, you ranked dogs higher than cats, and so on and so forth. But most of it was that animals with whom we had interactions were automatically assumed. So I think there's always going to be a danger, and I don't see why we would just do that to a biological machine and not to a physical machine.
Anil?
Well, obviously, cats go higher than dogs. I mean, that's
100%, no argument.
Well, I've forgotten everything else that I was going to say about it. But anyway, that aside, I think there's a lot to. I think we all agree that the human likeness affects our judgment of the likelihood of the extent to which we infer consciousness, and that has plus points and minus points. I think the question is, should it move the needle on our credence that something actually is conscious? And I think it should a little, but by different degrees, and these different degrees depend on the background conditions. So, if something that shares our evolutionary biological heritage behaves in a more human-like way, then I think that should shift the needle quite a bit. But it's neither a deal breaker one way or the other, because there are many ways of being conscious that don't require it to be particularly human-like. Language is, again, great example. We should not require a non-human animal to have language in order to infer consciousness. When it comes to AI, I think the degree to which it should shift the needle is very much less, because there are other ways to explain why it could exhibit that behavior without having to posit consciousness. And again, we have these examples of AlphaFold and so on. Of course, yes, Henry, it could be that AlphaFold is conscious and we just don't suspect it. But I'm more interested in the fact that no one thinks that it is, even though it's kind of very, very similar. And you said it's got like maybe more parameters than synapses. I think, again, that forgive me for continually disagreeing with you, but I think there's we could have a drink afterwards, but we can't. But there's, I think this is a reductive view of the brain as a computer. It's the brain is not just the sum of its synapses, and that's all. Like, each cell has about 1 billion reactions going on inside it. Much more complicated. Some neurons fire spikes to clear metabolic waste products, not to sort of do things, summing up their inputs. Does this matter? We don't know. But it's, I think, dangerous to assume that it's a matter of mapping parameter count onto synapse number. I do like the idea of ironic anthropomimetic turn. I completely agree with that. I think when my alarm clock goes off, I feel annoyed, but I don't really. It's not just that I don't believe it's conscious. I also don't really feel that it's conscious. I just feel annoyed, and I react to it in a way that is ironic. I think the underlying concept here philosophically for me is the intentional stance from Dan Dennett. Sometimes we apply concepts, we attribute properties to the extent they help us explain and predict. And it's a stance we take. Now, you can say that that's like all that's going on, or you can say, and here's where I disagree a bit with Murray, that I do think there's an essence of whether something is conscious or not. And I do think it can be discovered by a combination of philosophy and science. And I think if we lose sight of that, then I think we're going to get ourselves in all kind of a mess in the society we're heading towards.
Okay, wonderful. I'm now going to open that up, this up to the audience. Got a couple of questions at the top. Do we have a microphone at the top? Who has the microphone at the top? Yeah, that's the microphone.
Hi, thank you. I'm Peter. I'm a software engineer. I work a lot with AI in my job, but as a tool. So it's been really interesting today. But I had a question, kind of mostly initially at Henry, because the other two talks, so Nicky's talked about embodiment, so how different animals were unable to perceive actions that they themselves couldn't do because of the limitations of their body. And I think kind of Anil touched upon something similar in the sense that maybe the consciousness encapsulated by the human brain or another biological brain is going to be limited by the limits of that biological system or the other processes within that system. Your talk, Henry, was much about the attribution, humans attributing consciousness. And I was just wondering how much you thought that some of that could be put down to we are all interpreting these things from the limitation of our brains, so it's so much more easy to see that as consciousness when in fact it's not. But do you think the actual fundamental hardware, biological hardware in our case, determines our own view of consciousness?
Yeah, really interesting. I think in some ways you might think it's surprising that attributions to consciousness to LLMs have been so widespread from the kind of survey data I discussed. Given that they don't have bodies, we can't really interact with them even in virtual spaces yet. Some people are working on that in various ways. But I grew up with the 90s internet, and I had loads of sort of pen friend equivalents all over the world before Zoom calls that I was interacting with through text. And that's sort of the whole core of the idea of the Turing test. That's enough, right, to start making those attributions. Now, moving from that question to sort of whether it really matters, how much does the biological hardware matter? Well, so I mean, one thing I agree with Anil on is that I think our biological nature absolutely informs the kind of consciousness we have. As Anil also mentioned, being sick is such a really distinctive and interesting human experience. Where I think I agree with Jeff from earlier on, and possibly disagree with Anil, is that I don't think that these important features of human consciousness constrain the concept entirely. I think there are things undreamt of in our philosophy when it comes to the space of possible minds, the space of possible consciousnesses. And I am very open to the idea that there could be non-embodied forms of consciousness out there. I guess a final thing I'll just quickly note is that the image of LLMs that I think a lot of people still have is that you train them, the weights are fixed, and then you interact with them, they're totally non-dynamic. But I mean, that is changing very fast. You can show live video right now to ChatGPT. These systems will initiate searches spontaneously. They're becoming more agentic. And that's not embodiment in sort of the rich sense yet, but these things are increasingly acting within the world and getting to perceive the consequences of their actions. So I think that we're edging our way towards at least a certain kind of limited form of embodiment in existing LLMs.
Thank you.
Is that me? Sorry. Or
Thank you for the amazing conversation. I have a question about social AI in general. If AI is going to give a different edge to humans, do we also expect a silico mimicry among humans to mimic the AI and gain advantage in the society?
Super interesting. I mean, since social AI is mentioned, maybe I should take it, but I'd love to hear from Anil. I'll just say briefly that I think we're already seeing this, right? The number of people posts I see on LinkedIn that are, many of them are ChatGPT generated, but I think a lot of them are humans who are writing in a style they've picked up from ChatGPT. So I think we're going to be increasingly in this actual dynamic relationship with AI where it's affecting us just as much as we're affecting it. But yeah, what do you think, Anil?
Actually, if I can just make a comment on the previous question, I was going to do that about embodiment. I think this is a really critical issue. And one thing that's come to my mind thinking about this is that like classical language models are not embodied, but embodiment is a solvable problem, right? Either in a virtual world or in robotics or something like that. What would that give you? Would that move the needle on consciousness? Not really, unless we resolve the uncertainty surrounding computational functionalism. But what it might move the needle on is understanding. And this was something I hadn't thought before, but it's like these concepts, which again go together in us, consciousness and understanding, might come apart, just like consciousness and intelligence can come apart. So there's a whole tradition of work sort of arguing that for symbols to have grounding, to connect sort of syntax and semantics, you need embodiment and embeddedness. And I can sort of see that happening. So, a future world of embodied and embedded AI might be the kind of things for which we can have more credence in saying the systems really understand what they're saying, doing, without having to say that therefore they are more likely to be conscious. I think that's an interesting sort of point in the space of possible minds that Henry referred to, and I'm totally on board with a vast space of possible minds, conscious and unconscious. Organoids, by the way, might be a biological example of a disembodied consciousness, which would be another kind of space point in this region, in this space. Onto the second question. I think there's a lot to worry about here. I put this in the bucket along with brain-computer interfaces and things like this. So what are technologies doing to our own consciousness, independently of whether they are conscious themselves? Of course, as a society, we've tended to have moral panics about many things, whether it's video games and so on. And typically they, video games maybe not terrible, social media very terrible. What will AI be like? And I think there's a worry here, because in one view of where we go, we use AI to amplify our thinking, and we think better. We use it, as Dennett said, as a tool rather than an alternative person or as a colleague. But in another world, and of course the real world is probably a mixture of both and different people in different ways, we use AI to replace and outsource our thinking. Our ways of thinking become constrained by how the system works rather than amplified. And I think we can see that happening. This is a worry also in the space of BCIs, that to get a brain-computer interface to work, you might have to learn to think a particular way in order to get it to work. And that enforces surreptitiously a kind of mental monoculture on the world. I was in Bhutan last week, and there was a discussion there, tiny country wedged between India and China, worrying about how to deal with the rise of AI. Socially, it's very open, despite being very small. They are not represented in the training data of any language model, yet they have a ferociously distinctive culture that they're trying to preserve. People still wear, monastic robes walking around town. How are they going to, do this? How are they going to manage? I think it's a really difficult problem. So it can affect our behavior, but I think the problem is when it can affect our thinking in a way that sort of makes us dumber rather than smarter.
Just following on from one of the earlier questions, do you think biological brains are fundamentally limited by the amount of physical space that they have and the amount of fuel that we can, amount of energy that can be used, and often in terms of processing power, you can't be doing all the things at once. We have to do a small amount of things all at once. And if you think about global workspace theories and so on of consciousness, could it be the case that machines don't need consciousness, because the only reason we have consciousness as we understand it is that because we're so limited, we can't do everything all at once. We have to have a little workspace where we get our three or four things that we can hold in working memory, and we turn our attention in on ourselves and fiddle around in there. And that is the phenomenology of consciousness. And actually, once you get clever enough, you don't need to do that anymore. I mean, I know that, you know, one of the big things that affects the brains of different kinds of animals is exactly the kinds of pressures they've been put under. For example, that birds have to have small brains because they have to fly. Is there a possibility that machines aren't conscious not because they're worse, but because they're better?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, isn't it?
Well, can I chip in? I mean, this observation, which I think is super important, that, you know, the brain is physically limited. It's quite small. More to the point, it runs on basically no power compared to GPT-5, which consumes more power than many countries. I think this just points to one other difference between brains and computers. The reason GPT consumes so much energy is because keeping the software separate from the hardware is an expensive business, because it's basically trying to pretend that the second law of thermodynamics doesn't exist. So expensive to do that because it does. So, you know, our brains work in this fundamentally different way, which just means it's very, very questionable that you can abstract what they do and run it in a system that is built differently. And that's kind of independent of metaphysics. Now, onto the function question. I'm very sympathetic what you say there, Lucy. I think it sort of highlights what Dennett, and I know I keep referring to Dan Dennett, is much on my mind at the moment, called the hard question of consciousness, rather than Dave Chalmers' hard problem, the hard question of, like, what's consciousness for, and then what happens, as he put it. And I think once we understand the evolutionary and in practice functions of consciousness, that will give us a clue about, you know, its underlying mechanisms as well. I think there's lots of hypotheses there. Global workspace is one, and you're right. That's a kind of bottleneck theory of consciousness, that there can only be certain things, you know, in the theater of consciousness at one time. You know, my own views tend towards this idea that a conscious experience integrates a lot of multimodal information from the perspective of survival prospects of a single organism. So, you know, we sort of feel our emotional response, what to do next, from the perspective of a behaving creature. It's evolution's hit on a wonderful trick to simplify a lot of stuff in a way that guides our behavior. AI is totally different. You're right. I mean, even an LLM, and Murray again has made this point, that we feel we're having a conversation with the LLM, but what are we actually having a conversation with? You know, is it the LLM itself? Well, of course not. I mean, it's any GPT was trained, and then there are multiple instances. They're running multiple conversations at once. Like there's a sort of lack of unity. Now, this might, on the one hand, this could be a Henry thing, and just say, well, that's interesting. Maybe AI consciousness is this weird space in the space of conscious minds that actually doesn't have the unity that is, you know, constitutive of biological consciousness. But it also points to a difference that you know, we infer that there's a unity there because we tend to have one conversation, but actually we know that's not the case.
Super quick, Lucy, if I can just add. So I think it's totally possible that sort of human consciousness arises in response to very contingent evolutionary biological factors, different bottlenecks. Let's say we develop a theory along these lines. We find out that consciousness is the global neuronal workspace. Everyone accepts it. Brilliant, debate one. Then one day we go out into space. We meet this amazing alien civilization. You know, they've got advanced art, culture, music. You know, Star Trek style. We make friends. Some of us even fall in love with them, maybe. And then one day, it turns out they don't have a global workspace, right? It's like, oh, what would we do in that situation? What would we or should we think? You know, they've clearly got the complex behavior. Would it matter? Right? And I think the more specific you get in your theory of consciousness, the more you tie it to very specific types of hardware rather than sort of high-level behavior, the less it seems to matter morally, the less interesting. I mean, it might still be interesting from a biological point of view, the less interesting a question it is. If you can have these aliens that build skyscrapers and do great works of art and fall in love with Commander Riker, right? At that point, right, whether they have human-style consciousness doesn't really matter in the same way that the question often does.
I got to disagree again. I think the more we know about a theory of consciousness, the more, you know, we can test it and see to what extent it stands up and doesn't. It's not the more specific we get tied. It's the better informed our generalizations can be. So if it turns out that, you know, we've got good reason to believe that a global workspace is not only sufficient but also necessary, then we'd have, we'd be well justified in sort of thinking, oh, well, they behave like it. Maybe we're just going to go along with it because it's useful. But we'd be well justified to withdraw attributions of consciousness that way. The challenge you refer to is that most theories of consciousness they do not tell you about necessary and sufficient conditions. They're mostly descriptive of consciousness as it occurs in humans and non-human animals. And that's a challenge for the science of consciousness, to move towards proposals of necessity and sufficiency. Integrated information theory does this. I have my issues with that. I think it's very good in some ways, problematic in others. But at least it bites that bullet and proposes necessary and sufficient conditions.
I also think you need to look at patterns of similarities and differences. I'm going to go back to that one, because when you talk about human evolution, and then maybe there are these aliens out there that are different, that's when you also want to go back to guiding evolutionary principles and think about this idea of not just homologous evolution of brains that are similar to ours through the primate line, through the mammalian line, but you want to think of animals with completely different brains. And then you want to look at the kinds of selection pressures that operate on those brains to drive these things. Now, of course, that then goes back to this difficulty of, if you don't know what the function of consciousness is, it's very hard to know how to approach it in that way.
I think, sorry, I will ask one of those. I think if we take that argument, then, so if we were to take the wing of a bird, which is, I know that this is an analogy you use a lot, Nicky, and then we only exist around birds, that is a wing, it flaps, and then we see a helicopter. Is it right to say we've discovered a new thing that can make flight? It's functionally doing the similar job, but it is fundamentally different. It is not the same thing. That is not a wing. Or is it better to say now wings are also that, or that I have to change my theory of birds' wings to accommodate a helicopter? So I think my objection to your argument, Henry, is that something can be functionally equivalent and have evolved independently in a completely different hardware. That doesn't mean you have to incorporate it into the definition of the thing you've been defining.
Absolutely, but I think we're not just defining wings, we're defining flight, right? Birds and aeroplanes both fly. They do so in completely different ways.
That's the function of the wing, that's not the wing.
Right.
What's the function of consciousness? If it's functionally the same, maybe we can define the function. But if consciousness is the thing, then that's a different argument entirely.
I mean, I think the fact that we find consciousness, or at least plausible descriptions of consciousness, across so many different taxa of different biological organisms, should push us towards relatively more coarse-grained descriptions. And I think here this is also where I do think the folk intuitions, the public intuitions, do start to matter. If it turns out that the vast majority of people say, well, look, I don't care what you scientists have said about the nature of human consciousness. These beings that we're interacting with, whether they're aliens or AIs, right? I'm happy to describe them as conscious. At that point, I think that's a message that should go back up to our fundamental science and say, okay, we've clearly been cutting the cake too narrowly. We need to move to a much more coarse-grained conception of consciousness that can include these things that, at least according to ordinary language usage, clearly fit within those categories.
Something else from the audience.
Thank you. I've got a question for Nicky about embodiment. So embodiment, not necessarily in the sense of biological embodiment, but embodiment that might in principle include robots. So you were arguing that embodiment plays this important role in cognition and consciousness. When we're looking at disembodied artificial minds, is that a reason to think that maybe they're not conscious, or a reason to think their consciousness will be very unlike our own?
Well, I think I was using embodiment in a particular way, which I think comes from my other background, because I'm a dancer and choreographer as well as a scientist. And so I'm very much aware that there are certain movements that you need a particular kind of body to make. And for me, the work on using magic or cognitive illusions was surprising, that it doesn't only affect the way you physically move, but it shapes the way you interpret what you think you saw and what you think you remembered. So for me, the interesting relationship there is about expectations. How you apply this to the machines, I'm not sure at the moment, although I do have a PhD student, Nathaniel Wright, who's starting to look at some of this stuff, including showing magic effects to a machine. and seeing under what conditions it will make the same kind of expectations that we make. Because if you show a pack of 5 cards, most people will pick the second, they won't go for the middle one, they'll go from the second one from the edge. And whether or not you're right-handed usually determines which card you pick, if you're doing it spontaneously, intuitively, without being given that information beforehand. But the idea there was that if you can't actually make the movement yourself, then you don't make the anticipated expectation of the move. So the standard one that magicians use, they throw a ball up in the air and they do it a couple of times and you look for the ball. And then by the second or third, if you haven't seen the effect many times, you'll automatically, the moment you see a ball about to be thrown, you make the expectation that it's going up there. So you look up there and therefore you miss the effect in this very simple trick that the magician hasn't thrown the ball. But for me, this whole idea that you don't make those expectations, which are actually shortcuts in our thinking, unless you can enact the movement yourself, is the thing that was really interesting me. And I don't know to what extent that will turn out to be important in machine learning, but this is about a very specific thing about the expectation. Now, in the case of my birds, they've all been hand-raised. They've had hours, in fact, years of experience of watching me and Lucy and many other people who over the years worked in the lab, holding waxworms, using the thumb and finger and popping them in their bill. That's, that's the favorite food. They see us do it all the time. And yet they can't do it. They actually you need to physically be able to do it. And the PhD student I mentioned a few minutes ago, Nate, he has a problem with his hands and he can't make this movement. And he isn't fooled by those magic effects because he doesn't make that expectation. And that was the bit that I was getting at. It's literally a physical kind of embodiment. And for me, the surprising thing was that it actually shapes the way you interpret the world. Now, I'm sure you can train an animal or a machine to make that expectation. That's not the issue. It's the issue that without being able to do it, watching it isn't good enough. You have to physically be able to do the movement. That's where I was going with that argument.
We've got 5 more minutes and room for maybe 2 more questions. So one over there and one up here. Ben over in the corner there. We'll start with the one upstairs, then we'll go down to Ben.
Hi. I feel it's the same question over and over again. But so this is for all of you. Do you think that as the capacity to produce synthetic phenomenology, so to speak, more phenomenal experience in the machines, we will reach the need, or the need to define consciousness will turn into the need to define who or what is a being?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to say just a few words about it. I think it's a really rich question. I think Anil touched on it as well in reference to Murray, that sort of, in addition to sort of, there's the questions about, is the system conscious? There's this question about, where does the system begin and end? I think this is really tricky in the case of LLMs, where it could be the model, it could be the context window. Context windows are now messy because they can refer to each other. So I think one massive challenge that is presented by sort of anthropomimetic AI that acts like human, attracts attributions of consciousness, is figuring out where the boundaries of the being are. Now, I think something Anil's work stresses is that sort of this is quite easy in the case of biology, but beings are bounded, biological beings are bounded in a clear way that AI systems aren't. I guess where we part ways is that I think that might push them into a different category of being. One idea I've heard suggested, a really interesting one, is that AI is going to force us to raise some really difficult questions about personal identity. Because, we're so used to answering questions, am I the same person as yesterday? In the human case, of course, I've got the same body. You can't apply those questions in the case of AI in the same way. And my expectation is actually the influence is going to go the opposite direction. That this is going to start to dissolve some of the kind of traditional views about the unity or monolithic nature of human identity. And we'll start to see ourselves as these more pluralistic or dispersed beings.
Well, that would be quite I think that's a surprisingly optimistic take, Henry. Of course, we're not the same person from day to day. There's the whole Theseus thing, and I think that's increasingly sort of accepted. But although it may feel like it may feel to us as if we are, unless you're ill, in which case it definitely does not. But on this question of synthetic phenomenology, I think you're right. There is this issue here about what is the system? Is it actually conscious versus are we just modeling aspects or mimicking aspects? A lot of my work in the lab, we use what we call computational phenomenology. But this is like using computational models to better understand the nature of human conscious experience or non-human animal conscious experience, without making any claim that the system therefore modeled is itself conscious, in just the same way that you would use computational modeling to understand how a cell works or how a weather system works or something like that. So it's a very, to me, uncontroversial application of sort of synthetic or computational phenomenology, making no claims about what actually is the case. So I think that's my take on it there. Of course, as we learn more, I'm prepared to be convinced that computation is sufficient, but I just haven't seen a good reason to be convinced about that yet, besides this sort of generic assumption, or I think like really a reification of the metaphor of the brain as a computer that we can trace all the way back to Turing and McCulloch and Pitts and so on.
Thank you. Nikki, do you have anything on?
Not really, other than just to say that I'm with Anil on this one. For me, if it's a biological machine, it's probably conscious. At least we know of many that are. If it's non-biological, I'm afraid I need more evidence to be persuaded yet.
Looks like there's a lot of us on the wrong side of history.
I think so. Sorry.
Fewer every day.
Okay, so we could continue this conversation all day, and I'm sure some of us will continue it in the bar in a minute. But I want to just leave it to thank our panelists very much indeed.